Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another special gathering. Before we begin, I want to know who's here with me tonight. Leave a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is for you. All right, let's get to the first story. Good evening, Don. My name is Isabella. I was born and raised in a rural area in the United States where, even without constant medical presence, there were experienced midwives and women who prayed to ease illnesses. My family lived in a simple house with clay walls and a straw roof, an inheritance from my grandparents. There were always comments about charms and people who cast or broke spells, but I never believed much in those stories until everything started to fall apart. When I turned 17, I got pregnant by a boy from a neighboring farmland community. His name was Carl. At first he swore we would stay together, but as soon as my belly began to show, he disappeared. His mother, Mrs. Jacinda, made it clear she did not want me to keep the pregnancy. She said horrible things to my mother, hinting that the child would be a burden. Later I found out it even involved inheritance issues. Carl was an only child, and Mrs. Jacinda feared having to share some land with an unwanted grandchild. I tried not to let it get to me, but the situation affected my health. I was constantly sick with nausea and headaches. My mother, Mrs. Marina, was always my only protector. Even though she was upset about the pregnancy, she stayed by my side. When my nausea got worse, we didn't know what to do. There was no hospital nearby, and getting transportation was difficult. We tried the most common herbal teas, but nothing worked. Then someone suggested we look for Mrs. Mira, a respected midwife in the region, though some said she did more than just help with childbirth. I don't trust all this talk of witchcraft, but let's ask her for a remedy to give you some relief, my mother said. We went to Mrs. Mira's house in the late afternoon. It was a small wooden building by a creek, and the place had a strong smell of dried herbs. She examined me in silence, touching my belly gently. Then she prepared a dark green herbal tea and told me to drink it for a few nights. If you feel much discomfort, come see me again, but avoid going out alone at night, she said, as she handed me a bundle of herbs. Her voice was calm, but her gaze was indecipherable. I went home feeling intrigued. My mother didn't say anything, but I sensed her uneasiness as well. I decided to follow the midwife's advice. The first night I drank the tea, I slept heavily and had a confusing dream. A thin figure covered by a dark cloth whispered my name. I woke up startled, and for a few moments I thought someone was in the room. I saw nothing but shadows. I got up, splashed water on my face, and tried to calm myself. In the following days, the dizziness eased a bit, but the strange dreams persisted. My mother began watching me sleep because I'd wake up crying, saying I saw someone at the door. She would hold me, insisting that I was just anxious due to the pregnancy and Carl's abandonment. Even so, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was circling around me. The small town always had its stories of envy and the evil eye. During that period, I heard many rumors about women who lost babies without explanation or showed up with bruises after their children were born. Sometimes people pointed to Mrs. Mira as a suspect. Other times they blamed dark prayers commissioned by spiteful individuals. I didn't want to believe any of it, but I remembered Mrs. Jacinda's disapproving looks and felt an immediate shiver. She made it clear she didn't want that grandchild. Some people are saying that your ex-boyfriend's mother is looking for a spiritual worker to get rid of your pregnancy, a neighbor mentioned one day. My legs trembled at the thought. My mother chose not to comment, but at night she started lighting candles around the house, asking God to protect us. By my 4th month, I noticed the baby moved very little and at times abruptly, like he was uncomfortable. One afternoon, I felt sharp pains and nearly fainted. My mother rushed me to Mrs. Mira. She examined me and frowned. "Everything's fine, but don't let your guard down. Someone might be wishing you harm," she said, handing me another herbal tea. I admit my suspicion grew at that moment. I couldn't tell if she was warning me to help, or if she was also involved in something dark. At the same time, I had no better option. She was the closest midwife, and in an emergency, I would have to rely on her. Over the weeks, the nightly hallucinations worsened. I felt like someone was watching me while I slept. Sometimes I thought I heard a female voice outside. A deep insecurity took hold of me. My mother decided to seek help from Mrs. Analia, a faith healer who lived far away. We traveled by wagon along a bumpy road until we reached her house. She was a short lady who greeted us on a porch full of potted plants. She prayed, passed sprigs of sage over my body, blew herbal smoke around me, and grew pensive. "There's a great deal of resentment aimed at this girl. If you don't take care, it might turn into real witchcraft," she said in a serious tone. My mother asked what we should do. Mrs. Analia recommended certain prayers, asked me to wear a cord with a small piece of metal she had blessed, and advised me not to accept anything from people who might hate me. I left feeling more at ease, at least for a few days. The dreams decreased but didn't go away entirely. In my 5th month, I began to feel constant distress. One night I woke up with the sensation that someone was touching my belly, though not physically, more like a strange pressure. I rubbed my eyes and got up, lighting a small lamp. There was no one else in the room, just shadows cast by the furniture. My mother rushed in, alarmed by my scream. I told her what I'd felt, and she went quiet for a few moments. "We could call the priest, but he doesn't like these stories and thinks it's all superstition," she said, discouraged. Indeed, the local priest dismissed anything he considered witchcraft. He said that if I had problems, I should see a doctor. But medical care was a luxury to us, and the nearest clinic didn't do deliveries. As the pregnancy advanced, rumors spread around the small community. They talked about other women who might have suffered because of someone sending dark prayers. They never cited me directly, but I noticed people looking at me with pity or fear. Someone even suggested that Mrs. Jacinda was paying for me to lose the baby. My mother tried not to tell me everything, but I could sense her growing agony. Between my 6th and 7th month, I had unexpected bleeding. I thought I was miscarrying. I panicked. My mother summoned Mrs. Mira in a hurry. She arrived with a bag of clean cloths and a dark liquid meant to stop the bleeding. I spent the entire night awake in pain and uncertain whether the baby would survive. By morning, I noticed the bleeding had lessened and the pain had subsided. I had to stay on bed rest, which left me confined, increasingly fragile and vulnerable to my own worried thoughts. One night, while lying in bed, I clearly heard footsteps in the hallway. I called my mother quietly, but she was in the kitchen. When I finally stood up, there was no one there. The next day, I told her about it, and she decided to call Mrs. Analia for another prayer. The faith healer came, burned incense, read passages from the Bible, and performed protection gestures throughout the house. When she finished, she hugged me and said, "You must find inner strength. Someone wants you to lose hope so you'll lose the child." She spoke so convincingly that I felt goosebumps. I clung more to the prayers, though I'd never been that devout before. The truth was, in that situation, any support was welcome. During the 7th month, my mother watched me constantly. I avoided going out, only stepping into the yard for fresh air. One evening, a neighbor knocked on our door, saying she'd seen 3 women dressed in black near our house, talking suspiciously. She tried to approach them, but they walked away quickly and vanished. My mother went pale, praying under her breath. I tried not to think the worst, but stories of witchcraft there were very old, and someone always had a similar tale to tell. The pregnancy continued, but without any mental reprieve. I barely slept, afraid someone would harm me or cast another spell on me and my baby. By the 8th month, I noticed my body was increasingly weak. I had sharp lower back pains, as if something weighed more than normal. Mrs. Mira insisted my baby was healthy but in an awkward position, which could complicate delivery. Sure enough, the birth came early. It happened on a suffocatingly hot night. I woke up with intense cramps and a feeling that something was wrong. My water broke before I reached full term. I guessed around 32 or 33 weeks. My mother ran to get Mrs. Mira, who arrived with her supplies and settled me on a mat. The labor lasted almost an entire day because the baby wasn't properly aligned. I sweated so much I thought I would pass out. On top of that, the house felt weighed down by a silent tension, like something or someone was watching us. My mother rushed in and out to fetch water, while the midwife tried to position the baby. "I need you to breathe deeply and push with all your strength," Mrs. Mira said. I did as told, but my body felt frozen at times. It was as if someone was pressing on my belly from the outside, trying to stop the birth. The midwife noticed my desperation and asked my mother to bring boiling water. After countless contractions, a sharp pain nearly took my breath away. That was the final push. I felt the baby slide out, but I didn't hear immediate crying. Everything turned into a blur. My vision blacked out for a few seconds. When I came to, I was lying down, panting, and saw Mrs. Mira rubbing my baby boy's body. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. My mother was on her knees praying. Suddenly, a weak moan turned into a cry, and I realized he was alive. A wave of relief washed over me. But it didn't last long. I felt a gust of wind coming through the door as if someone had opened it. I wanted to turn my head, but I was too exhausted. My mother shouted, "Shut that door, someone's out there." I heard a murmur, or maybe I imagined it. Mrs. Mira ran to the entrance and found only the wind stirring the trees. She came back startled and told my mother to lock everything. I had no energy to ask questions. I held my baby, who was breathing weakly and was so small and frail that I worried instantly. Even so, I couldn't hold back tears. I spent the following hours clinging to him, afraid some evil presence would appear. In the days after, with my baby in my arms, I thought the worst was over. But strange marks started to appear. Sometimes he woke up with scratches on his belly or legs, shallow, yet alarming. Terrified, my mother called Mrs. Analia. The faith healer returned, prayed, performed blessings, and hung rosemary sprigs by the door. She gave the baby a herbal bath. It worked for a few days. Then the marks came back. "Let's leave this place," my mother said. "I don't want to live in this tension anymore." I was afraid to leave everything behind, but I agreed. It was better to try a fresh start somewhere far away. We gathered our few belongings and left quietly at dawn, heading to a small farm where a distant uncle lived. He was a quiet man, but he didn't refuse us shelter. My mother had some savings put aside from an old job of my grandfather's, plus a bit she made sewing and washing clothes. That would help us travel. Yet in our first nights there, the baby cried more than usual, and some purple marks reappeared on his little body. My uncle dismissed it as normal child fussiness, but my mother and I knew it wasn't that simple. Sometimes in the middle of the night, we heard noises on the roof like light footsteps. My uncle would go outside with a flashlight but found nothing. He grew irritated, thinking we were bringing trouble to his home. After a few weeks, he practically asked us to leave. We set off again with no clear destination. My mother continued to use whatever money she had left from her odd jobs. Whenever we arrived in a new town, I also did any work that paid a few coins. That's how we got by, stopping in place after place, searching for safety. During our wanderings, we met a spiritual healer named Raphael, who charged a fee for a protection ritual. He sprinkled a white powder along the windows of our temporary lodging and led a lengthy prayer. But the next morning, my baby had 2 scratches on his right arm, like fingernail marks. My mother cried, and I grew furious at my inability to protect him. We moved again, this time to a small boarding house in a modest part of another county. The room was cramped, smelled of mold, and looked neglected. The first night was peaceful, giving me hope we had escaped the spell. But the calm lasted only a short while. On the 3rd day, I woke at night to my baby crying as if terrified. When I lit a candle, I noticed a small cut on his forehead. My mother held him, trying to calm him, and whispered, "We'll never find peace while those people keep hating us." At dawn, I went out in search of a church to ask for help. The local priest treated me like I was overreacting, saying I needed medical care and that witchcraft stories were superstition. I was offended but kept it to myself. Returning to the boarding house, I found my mother talking to the owner, who suggested we find somewhere else if we felt unsafe there. Everywhere we went, it seemed either something followed us, or people simply didn't want to deal with our troubles. My mother started saying she regretted not having confronted Mrs. Jacinda directly. She believed that maybe a showdown was the only way to end it. I was terrified. Just hearing Carl's mother's name reminded me of her hateful stares. I preferred to keep running, rather than risk a confrontation that could go badly. On one of these journeys, we heard about a well-known spiritual healer named Raphael living farther north. He was said to perform liberation rituals. We decided to seek him out. It took us 2 days to reach his home, a simple shed surrounded by bamboo. He welcomed us calmly and listened to our story without surprise. He asked to hold the baby and, after observing him, said, "There is something very heavy upon you both, but I'll try to ward off the worst of it." We scheduled a night for the ritual. He requested earth from the road we traveled, some colored candles, and a bottle of holy water. We spent the entire night praying while he traced symbols on the ground, asking me to stand with my son in the center of a circle of coarse salt. At a certain point, Raphael held a small dark cloth object, claiming it embodied the malicious intent of whoever hated us. After many prayers and chants, he burned that cloth, which turned to ash in moments. I felt a strong wind blow through the door, as if to snuff out the candles, but they stayed lit. At one point, I heard something clink, though I saw no one touching anything. Raphael, however, kept praying unfazed. By dawn, he explained that if the resentment from our enemies persisted, we might not be completely free of danger, but he hoped we would find some relief. After leaving his place, we stayed at a nearby boarding house for a few days without seeing new marks on the baby. That gave us hope. My mother and I got by doing laundry and cooking for people, saving up spare change to survive. Sometimes I heard about a public hospital in another town, but we didn't have enough money to get there. One day, an older woman said she saw someone asking about a girl who was fleeing with her son. My mother and I nearly panicked, fearing it was a messenger from Mrs. Jacinda or even the woman herself. Weeks passed with no further incidents. Still, we kept moving from one lodging to another in an exhausting cycle of packing and unpacking. My baby was a few months old now, and it pained me to see him grow up with no real home, nowhere permanent. Then we heard of a job opportunity on a distant ranch where a man needed extra hands for kitchen duties. The foreman's name was Joel, and my mother got in touch through an acquaintance. The place was quite isolated, but at least it offered a roof over our heads. We traveled by bus, spending what was left of our small savings, carrying our bundles. The trip took ages, with many stops. When we arrived, the foreman greeted us with curiosity but didn't ask many questions. The ranch was large with fields and a corral. He showed us a small room by the tool shed and said we could stay there if we worked in return. During the first weeks, I slept without nightmares. The baby cried, but no fresh scratches or bruises appeared. My mother woke early to do laundry for the foreman's family, while I helped in the kitchen. At least we had better food now. Gradually we met the other ranch hands, all simple folks. One of them, Robert, looked at me kindly. I wasn't interested in a relationship, but he always offered help, asking if the baby needed anything. Time went by, and I began to hope our ordeal was behind us. Occasionally I would still wake at night thinking I heard something outside, but I'd peek through the crack and see only the dark fields. I preferred to think it was an animal. Once the foreman casually remarked, "They say sometimes strange people wander around here, but I've never seen anything. It's just folks afraid of the dark." I didn't want to encourage the conversation. I focused on work so he wouldn't make us leave. After a while, my baby, whom we now called John, approached his first birthday. He had recovered well from the premature birth and showed no obvious problems. He learned to stand and squeal happily. My mother and I felt a joy we hadn't known in a long time. It seemed like we'd finally found a normal life. Then I fell ill with a fever so severe that my head pounded. I spent 2 days in bed, and my mother cared for John while still managing her chores. He missed my arms, but I could barely stand. I recovered slowly. During that time, Robert brought us vegetables from the garden to add to my mother's soups. He was kind, and we grew closer. One day, he asked why I wore no ring or ever mentioned the baby's father. I only said the father had abandoned us. He didn't pry. Life on the ranch flowed on. I felt that the prayers and rituals from the spiritual healers truly had protected us, or that by moving so much, we'd lost our pursuers. We had no more direct attacks, no scratches, no nightly terror. The foreman gave me a small plot to plant vegetables. My mother adapted well to kitchen work, and my son John explored the fields curiously. We spent about 2 years there. In that time, John learned his first words and ran around the dusty yard. The simple life was good for me. I couldn't forget the terror I'd lived through, but I kept it locked away. One night, though, I heard a noise at the door. Grabbing a lamp, I opened it carefully, seeing only the wind rattling a piece of wood. I went back inside with my heart pounding. There was no one there, but it put me on edge for days. My mother, for her part, sensed we were on the right track. She said, "If someone still hates us, they don't know where we are. Let's stay quiet and not give any news." I agreed. I pushed down the memories of my birthplace and moved on. Eventually, Robert became more than a friend. He helped with John, played with him, made little wooden toys. I hesitated to trust fully, but I slowly let him into our lives. He didn't know my past in detail, and I kept it that way so as not to scare him off. When John was almost 3, something happened that startled me a bit. One afternoon, the ranch cook approached, looking serious. "I need to warn you about something. I dreamed a woman in black asked me where you and your son were." She spoke in a strange tone. My spine stiffened. Even though I'd put aside all the old superstitions, I couldn't help connecting it to my past. The cook kept an eye on the area and asked the workers if any strangers had come by. No one had seen anything. I stayed tense for weeks, expecting someone to show up. Nothing happened. Ranch life carried on. The foreman didn't hear about this dream. I kept it quiet so I wouldn't cause trouble. A year later, Robert and I were becoming a makeshift family. He was a decent man, slept in the men's quarters, but spent free evenings with me and my mother, caring for John like his own. I eventually decided it was time to have my son baptized in a small chapel a few hours away by wagon. Without fuss, we made arrangements. I got simple clothes for John, and the foreman allowed me 2 days off. It was a modest ceremony with a local priest who wasn't judgmental about my being a single mother. After the baptism, I returned to the ranch feeling a sense of peace. My mother also said she felt more protected. A few weeks passed without any news of people searching for us. My son ran around joyfully, playing with other children. Sometimes I wondered if someone from my old region might learn where I was, but concluded that years had gone by. Maybe Mrs. Jacinda had moved on or found other problems. Maybe her hatred had been replaced by something else. My mother and I agreed that we would stay here until old age, rather than return to our old home. Over time, the ranch became our permanent home. I was able to build, with Robert and the foreman's help, a slightly bigger room. I raised chickens and planted potatoes. John turned 5, and we threw a small birthday party for him. My mother, though older now, helped in the kitchen, and we invited a few neighbors. Watching my boy blow out a makeshift candle brought tears to my eyes. I remembered everything I went through to keep him alive. I silently gave thanks that we had finally found peace. I never again heard from Carl, John's father, nor from Mrs. Jacinda, nor did I check on what became of Mrs. Mira, the midwife who helped me, or Mrs. Analia, the faith healer who tried to protect us. I figure Raphael, the spiritual healer, carried on with his life as well. I prefer to keep my distance from that entire chapter. I still keep, in a way, the small metal cord that Mrs. Analia gave me, though I no longer wear it. It's a reminder that in desperate times, I clung to any sign of faith. Today I share this story because I feel I need to unburden myself. It's not a memory I enjoy revisiting, but I believe many women go through something similar, surrounded by fears and threats that seem unexplainable. Whether it was witchcraft or just the cruelty of a resentful family, I'm not sure. But I do know I ran away and protected my child the best I could. I never had the courage to face those who hated us head-on. I chose to escape, move around, and persist until my boy was born and grew up. No one asks anymore about the marks that once appeared on John's skin. They gradually vanished. Nothing stopped him from becoming a healthy, cheerful child. My mother aged peacefully on the ranch, and I allowed myself to start a new relationship, something I never imagined after so much pain. Though deep down I still worry someone might knock on my door one day, I ask myself if it's worth living in fear. Usually I answer no. Of all the lessons I learned, the greatest is that some people's bitterness can turn into something destructive. I don't know if there's truly more out there than what we can see. But back then, Everything indicated negative forces surrounded us and nearly claimed my son's life. Now, I focus on the simple life I managed to build. The pain and the fear became chapters in a story that, by God's grace or fate, ended in peace. I live now with the certainty that my boy, who's grown up, remembers nothing of those early days. And that brings me comfort. If he ever wants to know the details, I'll share them carefully, showing him that a mother's love and faith can overcome even the darkest shadows. It's a painful memory, but also a triumph. He's alive, I'm here, and we carry on without looking back. Before we move on to the next story, if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell to get the latest stories. Your presence means a lot, and your support is essential. All right, let's keep going. My name is Nicholas. I was born in a rural part of the United States in a modest house that was always in need of repairs. My family consisted of my father, Silas, my mother, Roberta, and my younger sister, Yara. For many years we lived with very little, trying to save every penny to pay our overdue bills. My father hated that situation. He was not the type to explode easily, but you could tell when he was consumed by thoughts of what we referred to as financial failure. It was as if he were trapped in a maze whose corridors got narrower every day. For as long as I can remember, I watched Silas go in and out of jobs that paid almost nothing, collecting bill receipts and punching numbers into an old calculator. He insisted on keeping me away from these worries, but I could sense something was eating at him. Some nights I heard him talking to Roberta in the kitchen. She tried to ease the tension. She said all that mattered was having a roof over our heads and a united family. But he disagreed. He talked about the ambitions he had before getting married and swore he didn't want to spend his whole life drowning in debt. Around the time I turned 13, Silas started disappearing frequently. Sometimes he'd be gone all day, saying he was at interviews or dealing with paperwork. Roberta never questioned him out loud, though I noticed her anxiety. One time he came home late without giving me any explanation. I wanted to ask where he'd been, but I stayed quiet. The next morning, I was surprised to see him excited, saying he'd found a golden opportunity. He gave no details but seemed genuinely pleased, which was rare for him. A few weeks went by and our lives changed dramatically. Silas showed up with enough money to clear most of our overdue bills and renovate parts of the house. Instead of endless leaks in the roof, he replaced the whole thing with new shingles. He bought different clothes and even had our old motorcycle fixed, which had been sitting unused for a long time. Roberta became suspicious, but she didn't argue with him. You could see she was holding back her curiosity, perhaps afraid to discover what was behind it all. A few months later, Silas announced he had managed to buy a bigger house somewhere else with plenty of land around it. He spoke about it as if it were a huge accomplishment. I didn't protest, but Roberta's worried expression bothered me. I was 14 then, and I saw Yara, just 7, so innocent, quietly facing the idea of changing schools and routines. Even so, she showed no excitement. When the brand new pickup truck Silas had bought arrived, Yara just glanced at it and went back to playing in the yard without reacting. She seemed to sense our life was heading into the unknown. We moved on a weekend. The new house was quite spacious. It had a metal gate, a walkway lined with a few trees, and then the front door. The place was so big it left me feeling disoriented. The decor included antique furniture left by the previous owners. I couldn't decide if I found it beautiful or strange. Yara complained about a weird smell in one of the rooms, but Silas told her to ignore it, assuring us that everything would be spotless soon. During the first nights, I noticed a different kind of silence. It was the kind of secluded place where you couldn't hear cars or neighbors, only the occasional hoot of a night bird. It made me uneasy. A few days later, I realized Silas was spending long hours in a makeshift office he had set up in one of the rooms. He'd emerge from there deep in thought, his eyes sunken, as if he'd stayed up all night. Roberta grew skittish. I saw her lighting candles in the living room and telling Yara not to wander too far down the corridors. Sometimes she'd come into my room just to ask if I was okay. I found it strange because she'd never been that overprotective. She didn't explain why she was so cautious, but I could feel something was troubling her. When I asked what was wrong, she hesitated. "Trust me, Nicholas, sometimes it's better not to know everything." Not long after, strangers started visiting Silas. They arrived at night, always dressed in dark clothing. They'd come in through the front door, speak with him in hushed tones, and then leave without saying goodbye. Soon enough, even Roberta avoided walking around the house when they came. She seemed afraid of running into an unwanted guest. Once, she whispered to me, "These meetings of your father's don't seem normal." I asked if she had figured out how Silas got so much money, but she just shook her head. "Look after Yara and don't push your father with questions." I didn't understand why, but I agreed. As the weeks went by, Silas became more withdrawn. He didn't joke around and never took us anywhere. He spent hours locked in his office or left the house without telling us where he was going. I tried not to dwell on it, but the atmosphere unsettled me. Yara started waking up in a fright. She said she felt someone walking down the hallway near her room at night. When I tried to calm her, she said something vague, as though she saw a dark shape standing in a corner. I asked if she was certain, and she just nodded with a scared expression. One afternoon, we got news that an aunt of ours, Roberta's sister, had died in a car accident. Her vehicle had flipped over for no apparent reason, and the authorities couldn't explain what had happened. Roberta was devastated. I thought Silas, despite being distant, would comfort her, but he stayed cold. He just said he was sorry and went to his office. That indifference sent chills through me. I started wondering if my father was still the man I had known in my childhood. After my aunt's funeral, the house became gloomier. Roberta started locking all the doors well before nightfall and advised, "Nicholas, stay close to me and your sister. Don't wander around the house alone." I could tell she was afraid of something, but I couldn't pinpoint what. Every night I heard light footsteps. I'd go downstairs to see if it was Silas moving around, but he always claimed he never left his office. Yara continued sleeping badly. Sometimes she'd sit up in bed and point to a corner of her room without saying a word. One night my father had more visitors. I went to get a glass of water from the kitchen, and on my way through the living room, I saw Silas with his back turned, head bowed, surrounded by 3 men speaking in low voices. I caught a few words like contract and guarantee, but I didn't get the context. Back in my room, I tried to sleep, but kept imagining this group had something to do with how Silas got rich. The next day, the tension reached a boiling point. Roberta pulled me aside in the hallway and warned, "If your father asks you anything about me or your sister, just say you don't know. Don't trust those men who come here." I asked why. She just insisted I obey. Later, while I was reading in the living room, Silas approached me, gave me a tired stare, and said nothing. He sat close by and stayed perfectly still. The silence ate at me, so I got up and went to my room. Yara started getting sick. She had a fever almost every night. One afternoon, she showed up in the living room looking pale and shaking uncontrollably. Roberta took her to the doctor, but the tests showed nothing conclusive. They checked her blood and vitals and couldn't find the cause of the fever. A week later, near midnight, it came back even worse. The only thing Yara managed to say, almost crying, was that she wanted to go back to our old home. Seeing Yara suffering and Silas's indifference, Roberta decided we should leave that house. She planned it in secret. She packed our bags and told me not to mention it to my father. The same night Silas went out with one of the strange men. We called a taxi and left in a hurry. Yara was so weak she could barely speak. Inside the car, Roberta kept looking out the window as if afraid someone might follow us. We stayed at a cheap motel near a highway. The place was simple but felt safe enough. The owner didn't ask many questions. He just handed over the key and pointed us to our room. We spent the first hours locked inside. All we could hear was the sound of trucks rumbling in the distance. 2 days passed with no news from Silas. My mother made some phone calls to acquaintances, but no one knew anything about him. Meanwhile, Yara got worse. She had nightmares, waking up terrified, mumbling that someone was calling her. I tried to comfort her, but I was as confused as she was. That was when I realized where our travel money came from. My mother had taken some of the leftover money from selling the old house, plus whatever savings she had stashed away. Some distant relatives also helped, though they had no clue what was really going on. Even so, the funds were limited. On the third day, the motel owner told us a man had stopped by asking for us. He didn't give a name and left quickly. Roberta decided we couldn't stay. We packed our bags at night and went to the bus station, taking a bus to a bigger city in hopes of vanishing in the crowd. When we arrived, we rented a cramped room in an old building with narrow hallways. The place smelled of mold, but it was all we could afford. Roberta locked the door as soon as we came in and never left Yara's side. By the end of that week, we finally learned of Silas's whereabouts. A friend called my mother, saying my father had been found dead in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. There were no signs of aggression or obvious violence. We were stunned. Roberta gathered our things, and we went at once to identify the body. At the site, the police wouldn't let us get too close. From a distance, I could see Silas slumped against a wall, his body arched. One officer mentioned that his eyes were in such a strange state that no one could determine how he'd died. My mother signed the necessary papers without a word. The funeral was small. Only a few of his acquaintances appeared. I noticed one person who vaguely resembled the men who used to come to our house. He stood in the back and never spoke to us. Once the casket was lowered, he disappeared. We returned to that tiny apartment in the larger city. Roberta changed her behavior. She kept the curtains closed, didn't answer phone calls, and mentally replayed our recent days. Yara was still quiet. She seemed to feel not only the loss of our father, but also something else, as if something hovered around her. I started going through a notebook Silas had left behind. It contained odd notes about deals I'd never heard of, plus scribbles with dates followed by cryptic descriptions like renew or fulfill. There were even names of distant relatives we'd never met. Nights in that city were no different, cars on the streets, people around, yet we felt no less tense. The feeling of being watched lingered in every hallway of that building. Even if I didn't want to call it supernatural, something in the air made me uneasy. Roberta, meanwhile, visited a friend who supposedly knew about mystical matters, but returned with nothing concrete. She just said, "There's no easy way out of this kind of thing." One day, Yara had a sudden crying fit. She clung to my hand, saying she had dreamed of Silas standing in front of our door. My mother heard but showed no reaction, too exhausted to look for explanations. That night, strange sounds echoed through the building. The landlady said she'd heard knocks and footsteps in our wing. We pretended we didn't know anything, though Roberta was already planning to move again. We took only a few bags and headed for someplace more remote. The trip was long. We passed through unfamiliar towns. My mother kept insisting we needed to meet someone more skilled in breaking curses. She used that term half-jokingly, but it still held a hint of truth. Until then, I wasn't sure if I believed in such things, but I was starting to consider anything was possible. Eventually, we arrived at a rural area where people directed us to a woman known for performing blessing rituals. Her home had a dirt floor, plain walls, and no reliable electricity. She greeted us with suspicion, spoke privately with my mother, and asked me to wait outside on the porch. Yara lay down next to me, holding my hand. Night fell quickly, with no streetlights around. Inside, a single lamp lit the space. By morning, the woman summoned my mother and spoke to her in hushed tones, making it obvious there was no quick solution. She said some debts extend beyond life, and praying alone won't break that kind of bond. Then we said our goodbyes and left. Back on the road, the same sense of fleeing accompanied us. We rode bus after bus, looking for another place to hide. Yara would either sit in silent withdrawal or cry with stomach pains. During one of the stops, my body began to show signs of exhaustion. I felt dizzy and dropped to my knees in the bus station, too weak to stand. Roberta and Yara helped me onto a bench. A few minutes later, my strength returned, but a sharp ache lingered in my neck. Eventually, we went to another bustling city. We rented a room at a rundown boarding house that smelled of stale food in the hallways. We spent a few days there, and I noticed Yara wasn't getting better, and my mother could barely sleep. To make matters worse, someone showed up at reception asking for us yet again, without giving a name. Roberta trembled but tried to hide it. That night I got scared when I tried to use the payphone in the hallway. I heard a faint sound on the other end, like someone breathing, so I immediately hung up. I asked the owner if there was a problem with the line, but she said no. When I returned to our room, I found Yara sweating on the bed, saying she'd seen a man in dark clothes in the backyard. I checked the window. No one was there. I chose not to press her so she wouldn't get more upset. With tension building, I decided to go through Silas's notebook again. I noticed repeated references to past and future meetings. One page listed family members' names with notes like, "The next one must take over or it runs in the blood." It might have seemed nonsensical, but it reminded me of how my father was once desperate before he suddenly had money. Perhaps he'd gotten involved in something that demanded a bigger sacrifice, and now we were stuck with the bill. There was also mention of some association he had to report to regularly, stating that if he failed, it would pass on to his descendants. A few days later, we decided to leave again. We needed to avoid being tracked. We took a bus to another place that someone mentioned, where a local woman supposedly understood old promises. After hours of travel, we arrived at a small farm. A frail-looking woman answered the door. She clearly didn't feel like chatting, but let us spend the night. At dawn, she explained that if my father had signed on to something as part of his bloodline, it wouldn't be resolved simply by running away. She waved her hands as though there was nothing more to say and told us to be careful. We wandered for weeks without a definite destination. Yara kept getting fevers, and my mother had to admit her to a county hospital in an emergency situation. They gave her medication, kept her under observation for 2 days, and repeated all sorts of tests, but again no one could find an explanation. Late at night, I paced the hospital corridors, lit by fluorescent lamps. Each step echoed in my mind. At one point, I noticed a man in a dark suit standing at reception, but when I went closer, there was no one. Maybe it was my imagination, but I felt a tightness in my chest. I decided not to tell Roberta or Yara. Yara's fever subsided and we left the hospital. We found yet another cheap motel. An elderly man ran the place and didn't ask questions. Our room had poorly painted walls and smelled like an old closet. The first night there, around 2 in the morning, I heard a quiet knocking at the door. I thought about opening it to see who was there, but changed my mind. I waited a few seconds, and it stopped. My mother realized I was awake and whispered, "Nicholas, don't open it. Whoever it is, just don't." I closed my eyes but didn't sleep. The silence was so heavy I could hear my own breathing. In the morning, I asked the proprietor if anyone had knocked on our door. He said no. I didn't insist. Meanwhile, we tried to contact anyone who might have known Silas. Most said he'd appeared out of nowhere with money and avoided talking about it. The only consistent point was that he'd joined some association shrouded in secrecy. Different rumors suggested it was illegal or even esoteric, but no one knew for sure. It was clear his sudden wealth brought disastrous consequences. My mother decided we should go back to that big house where everything started, believing we might find answers among the belongings we'd left behind. We arrived near sunset. The house was boarded up, the windows sealed. A makeshift security guard checked our IDs and let us in. We walked through dusty halls, feeling a heavy atmosphere despite being used to tension. I rummaged through some cabinets until I found a sealed box. Inside were papers similar to those in Silas's notebook, disjointed notes, symbols, and the date he formally bought the property. There was also a small envelope mentioning maintaining the legacy. Roberta, upon seeing it, whispered, "Nicholas, none of this came out of nowhere. Your father knew what he was getting into." Yara started complaining of a headache. We left without many answers, but we were sure Silas had gotten involved with something that affected our entire family. On the way out, I noticed the guard watching us, but I kept calm. We returned to the motel, packed our belongings, and prepared to leave once more. The owner was clearly uncomfortable having us there. Our room seemed to attract strange events, creaking noises, knocking, and even what some guests described as whispers in the middle of the night. The following evening, I went to the bathroom down the hall. When I came back, Yara was waiting at the door, visibly shaken. "I heard voices inside," she said. I rushed in but found no one. Roberta was on the bed, silently praying. I locked the door again and thought, we can't keep living like nomads forever. 2 days later, I collapsed in the lobby. My mother rushed to help me. I felt an intense weakness in my legs and chest. I woke up on a couch, not sure how long I'd been out. The motel owner offered me some water and suggested I see a doctor, but I didn't feel ready to explain our situation to anyone, especially if that meant showing paperwork and possibly being found again. The next morning, the owner politely asked us to find another place, saying our presence was unsettling the other guests. Roberta agreed, seeing that we couldn't stay there long anyway. We caught a bus to a different town. By then, I realized I was almost 16. Nearly 2 years had passed since we first left our old home, and everything we'd gone through had left me worn out. On the bus, I saw Yara sleeping on our mother's shoulder, exhausted, and Roberta staring blankly out the window. She seemed to have lost hope. When we arrived, it was already dark. We found a small room in a shared house. The landlady showed us up a side staircase. We carried our bags and saw no one else. Inside, the space felt stuffy, lit by a single bulb that flickered twice before turning fully on. I was sick of moving around so much when, late that night, I heard my mother whispering, "If we don't fix the problem, we're going to lose more than just a night's sleep." I tried to listen carefully, but her voice was too soft to catch everything. I decided not to ask. Yara slept peacefully for the first time in weeks, without waking in a fright. The next day, the landlady mentioned that someone had come by early in the morning, asking if a woman, a teenage boy, and a little girl were staying there. She said she told him she didn't know any family that fit that description. Roberta and I exchanged glances, sure we were still being followed. We just didn't know whether it was the same men tied to my father's money or something beyond the rational world. That same week, I revisited Silas's notebook. On one page, written in shaky letters, was the phrase, "Blood ties uphold the deal." Below it, another sentence was heavily crossed out, unreadable. I held the page up to the light, trying to see the original text, but it was too blurred to make out. My heart tightened. I remembered Silas teaching me to ride a bike when I was smaller. How could everything change so drastically in such a short time? My eyes welled up, but I wouldn't let my mother see. She had enough to worry about. The headache returned in the middle of the night. I sat up, trying to breathe slowly. Roberta woke and asked if I needed a doctor. Before I could answer, we heard a loud thump downstairs, like something heavy had fallen. We froze. Yara kept sleeping. I waited, but nothing else happened. The light flickered again. My mother sighed and lay back down. The next day, the landlady told us a big box in her storage area had tumbled to the floor. She also made a vague comment about an odd vibe in the rooms. We decided once again to find a new place. Our savings were almost gone, but we still had some money left from selling old belongings. My mother did small sewing jobs on the side, while I helped with odd jobs to earn spare change. We packed up the little we had and prepared to leave. Before we did, my mother answered a phone call from the hallway phone. An unknown number. She listened silently for a few seconds and then hung up. Her expression said it all. She asked no questions, explained nothing. She just grabbed Yara and signaled me to go. The next trip was long. We took 2 buses and ended up in an area where a family friend of my grandparents had a vacant house. We asked if we could stay for a while. They agreed, not prying into details. The house was small and built of wood with 2 windows facing an empty lot. Inside, a heavy smell of dampness filled the air. We were grateful for the chance to stay. I slept on a small mattress in the living room, while Yara and my mother shared the single bedroom. The first couple of nights were calm enough, until the 3rd night. I woke up sweating and heard Roberta calling me softly. I went to the bedroom. Yara was lying down with a strange look on her face. It wasn't exactly pain, more like something was paralyzing her. I tried talking to her, and she blinked very slowly. Roberta said she'd had a raging fever earlier and nearly rushed her to the hospital again. None of us slept until dawn. After a few more days, the family who owned the place confessed they were worried. They mentioned hearing noises at night. Roberta promised we'd move on soon. I hated feeling like a burden, but I couldn't deny something unusual was happening. I finally confronted my mother. "Mom, there has to be an explanation for all this. What's really going on?" She took a deep breath and told me that before marrying her, Silas had heard stories in his family about pursuing money at any cost. Nobody believed those tales, assuming they were just legends. But over time, desperate for a way to provide for us, Silas accepted what he called an alternative. From what Roberta gathered, this agreement wasn't just with ordinary people, but with something beyond our plane of existence. She never saw any specific ritual, but she believed Silas made a deal to gain wealth in exchange for a deeper commitment involving future generations. It was as if he'd bound the family to some association, even after the one who signed had died. We fell silent. None of us knew what sort of force might appear or how it would manifest, but it seemed obvious that Silas's death hadn't closed his account. When she finished talking, I heard a cracking sound in the wooden beams. Could have been just the wind, but after everything we'd been through, it was hard not to imagine something else. Yara wasn't improving, so we moved yet again. By then we'd lost count of how many places we'd stayed. We boarded a night bus. The trip took hours, mostly on back roads, stopping at small stations. At one stop I got off to buy some water, and on my way back thought I saw a man in a suit standing at a distance. When I blinked, he was gone. It might have been a random passerby, but my heart pounded. When we reached our next destination, we managed to rent a room in the back of a house owned by an older woman who cared for her 2 grandchildren. She let us stay on the condition we pay up front. Roberta agreed. The space was as simple as all the others we had occupied. One window with a dingy curtain and a single ceiling bulb. In the first days, I tried helping Yara with some schoolwork because she'd missed months of classes. Her fevers seemed less frequent, but still returned around midnight. One night, I stayed up until sunrise, staring at that window, feeling like something lurked beyond it. I tried to avoid jumping to wild conclusions, but the doubt gnawed at me. After about 2 weeks, the landlady mentioned a man had been lurking in the neighborhood, asking questions about us. My stomach dropped. Roberta just nodded, as if she expected it. One night, Yara woke up in another crisis, murmuring, "He was out there." I asked who she meant, but she didn't answer. She looked entranced. She soon fell back asleep. That was when my own symptoms grew worse. I began having severe headaches. Roberta considered taking me to a clinic, but I didn't want to fill out any forms. I was scared we'd be tracked if we showed our IDs. Every day I felt weaker, as though my energy was draining away. I didn't want to believe it was anything supernatural, but circumstances left me more and more uncertain. One evening, a light rain fell and I reached my breaking point. I collapsed in the doorway of our room. When I came to, I was in a makeshift chair and Yara was sobbing, begging me to be okay. Roberta just watched me, looking lost. I couldn't tell how long I'd been unconscious, but once I stood, I had an eerie feeling my life was following my father's path toward an unexplainable end. I closed my eyes, trying to push that thought away. The following night, something happened that still haunts me. The house became dead silent. No rain, no wind. At some point, I noticed the door was unlocked, though I was certain I had locked it before going to bed. I got up, turned the key, and heard footsteps moving away outside. I opened the door but found the corridor empty. Quietly, I called for my mother and told her what happened. She grabbed my arm and said not to mess with it, to lock the door again. I did as she asked, but I couldn't shake my unease. At dawn, I asked the landlady about it, but she said she hadn't been out there. Roberta decided we would leave once more, though by then I had no energy for yet another move. We packed slowly. I told her to watch over Yara while I stepped out to get some air in the small backyard. I noticed the gate was open and saw faint footprints in the damp ground, as if someone really had been prowling around late at night. It didn't take long for us to hail a car and go. We drove toward a more remote area. Roberta and Yara both dozed off in the back seat. I stared out the window thinking of Silas. A mix of longing and anger welled up in me. He'd left us with a legacy none of us wanted, and even in death, he seemed to pull the family into a place where peace was impossible. The driver refused to go any farther down a certain road, so he dropped us off in a deserted spot. We walked the rest of the way, with Yara complaining of exhaustion. Finally, we reached a small wooden house belonging to an acquaintance of Roberta's. She let us lay out 2 mattresses in the living room. We spent the night listening to the wind whistle through the cracks in the walls. Then, sometime after midnight, I woke with a stabbing pain in my head. I opened my eyes and thought I saw a figure slip past the door leading to the yard. I couldn't be sure. I blinked, my vision fuzzy, my body heavy. The next day I woke with a fever. Roberta and Yara were worried, but there wasn't much to do except rest. While lying there, I recalled Silas's notebook, so I asked my mother to bring it to me. I flipped through it until I reached the last page, which was blank except for a small reddish stain. My heart raced. Yara approached and asked if I was okay. I didn't answer. I closed the notebook, shivering at a feeling I couldn't logically explain. That afternoon we decided to move on yet again, but something happened first. As we tried to cross the yard to call for a ride, I tripped and fell into a patch of dry branches. I blacked out for longer than I realized, maybe half an hour, I'm not sure. When I came to, I found myself alone in a corner of the property, about 20 yards from the house. My mother and sister were nowhere in sight. I shouted their names. No response. I ran back inside, no one there. I checked the yard. Nothing. I walked to the road looking for clues. I saw tire tracks in the soft dirt which hadn't been there before. In the distance, I spotted a man standing by a tree. He looked tense, but I couldn't make out his face. As I tried to approach, a paralyzing chill engulfed my whole body as if my legs weighed a ton. Unsure what else to do, I returned to the house and sat on the living room floor, thinking about calling for help. But there was no phone. I stayed there motionless for a long time. Night fell and I was still alone. There was no sign of Roberta or Yara. I spent the hours awake, sitting by the door, waiting. At some point I dozed off and dreamed of Silas. He looked at me with that same cold stare he'd had near the end. I woke with a jolt, drenched in sweat, realizing the house was as silent as ever. I tried to stand but felt a sudden weakness. I needed water, air. Summoning what strength I had, I got to my feet. I crossed the yard toward the main road. It was pitch black, not a single light in sight. The wind was the only sound. I walked for about half an hour, calling my mother's and sister's names, but heard nothing. Eventually, I remembered Silas's notebook was in my backpack. I stopped and opened it. That blank page now had faint writing on it, as if someone had scribbled, "The heir has been chosen." I wanted to believe I was imagining it, but it looked real. I tore out the page and threw the pieces into a ditch before moving on. I whispered to myself, I won't accept this. But who was I talking to? I still don't know where my mother and sister went. They'd never leave me behind if they were safe. As for me, I feel the same exhaustion Silas showed in his final days. My legs give out, my head throbs, and no one believes my story when I try to explain. It's been weeks of drifting, working odd jobs for cash, sleeping in rooms I rent for a night or two. Sometimes I think that if Silas got us into this dangerous game, maybe I'm stuck with the consequences for the rest of my life. Yet I still hold on to a shred of hope that Roberta and Yara are somewhere out there, free of this web my father spun. Deep down, I've realized this story doesn't end with the death of the one who signs the contract. It continues, chasing anyone who shares the same blood. I'm not sure if people believe me when I talk about it. All I know is that wherever I go, the past finds me, and I'm stuck in the dark with no clear exit date. If you're enjoying the stories, don't forget to leave a like. It really makes a difference. Okay, let's continue. Good evening, Don. My name is Mario, and I worked for a good part of my life in a cemetery in a small rural town. I always approached the job in a practical way, tending to the graves, opening plots when needed, keeping the place clean and organized. I never had much patience for ghost stories. I believed death was just a natural cycle and didn't think the dead could cause any trouble. That belief stayed with me for over 20 years. But there was something I hadn't encountered yet. Silent rituals can leave strong echoes, especially in a place where silence is already the norm. I used to arrive early right after daybreak to organize my tasks. The routine was almost always the same. I would gather the tools, check if anyone had left flowers scattered along the walkways, and make sure there weren't any animals that could damage a headstone. At night, I locked the gate and did a quick round before going home. Most days passed without major surprises. At most, I'd find a visitor who got lost among the older graves or stopped to chat. Everything started to change after a burial that at first didn't seem so different from the others. The deceased was named Marion, an older man known for being an expert in old prayers. People said he used prayers that went beyond the traditional, involving herbs, incense, and things I never tried to understand well. He had lived in the region for decades but rarely appeared in public. Some residents said he had a reputation as a healer and that he would offer his prayers to solve health problems or bring good luck. Initially, I thought his funeral would follow the usual pattern: a wake, a final farewell from the family, then the burial. But when the family arrived, I was intrigued by the way they were dressed. Instead of the usual black, they wore light-colored flowing clothes and didn't exchange a single word among themselves. I watched from a distance as they placed the coffin in a corner covered by an improvised tarp, even before going to the grave. I noticed none of the relatives cried. They just had very serious expressions, as if waiting for something. I couldn't tell if it was contained sadness or some kind of ritual. When the time came to carry the coffin to the grave, the group formed a semicircle around the plot I had opened earlier. They remained in total silence for a few moments. Then a tall man, who I assumed was Marion's brother, began chanting softly without any instruments. I couldn't understand the words, but I sensed it wasn't a common prayer. One or two family members placed small objects on the coffin: dried leaves, beaded amulets, and colored candles, all arranged carefully. I stood a few feet away, waiting to cover the grave, but there was something unsettling about that ceremony. It wasn't loud or flashy. Rather, the fact that it was so contained made it seem charged with an energy that left me uneasy. As soon as they finished, the tall man looked at me and nodded, indicating I could start shoveling earth onto the coffin. They left all the objects there around the coffin. No one picked up anything. I threw the first shovelful of dirt without paying much attention to what I was burying, but I felt it was unusual. Lit candles, leaves that gave off a strange scent. When I finally finished the job, the group gathered again and left in a line without saying a word to me. The air felt heavier than usual, but I convinced myself it was just my imagination. That night I went home and tried to put the matter out of my mind. It had been a busy day because the cemetery was full of flowers scattered around from a previous memorial event, and I had needed to organize everything before leaving. But sleeping wasn't so simple. I tossed and turned, thinking about how that family behaved. It wasn't exactly frightening, but it gave me an odd feeling, as if something had been left incomplete. The next morning I arrived at the cemetery feeling uneasy, though I couldn't explain why. As I unlocked the gate, I noticed a strong scent of burning herbs, almost as if someone had done a cleansing or smudging right there in the middle of the night. I checked the surroundings and found nothing out of place, so I figured maybe a local resident had passed by with some incense. I went straight to the spot where Marion was buried. To my surprise, the candles that had been left outside the grave were lit again. Even more confusing, they were stuck upright in the soil, almost in a circle, and the dried leaves I remembered burying were back on the surface, as if they had been removed. I stood there unsure what to think. I had seen it all covered with earth myself. I decided to collect everything since my job was to keep the cemetery in order. I picked up the candles, which were still burning, though they looked only half consumed, and gathered the leaves, which were still intact despite having been buried. I threw everything into a bucket and took it to the incinerator at the back, where we usually burn old flowers or remains from exhumations. I didn't bother mentioning it to anyone right then. I typically worked alone in the morning, and my colleague Damien only arrived later. The day proceeded normally. At dusk, as usual, I did my final round before closing the cemetery. I walked through the aisles, checked if any side gates were open, and ended by Marion's grave. Something caught my attention. There was a dark stain on the soil, as if someone had poured some liquid over it. I stepped closer and caught a smell similar to the burnt herbs from that morning, but much stronger. I can't say why, but my first instinct was to turn my back and hurry away. I locked the gate and went home, trying not to dwell on it. Still, the memory of that stain lingered in my mind. That night I slept fitfully. I woke several times feeling a strange anxiety, almost as if I had a fever, though my forehead was cool. I got up, drank some water, and tried to calm down. I thought about turning on the TV to distract myself, but chose to remain in the dark, willing my body to rest. When dawn came, I went to work with tired eyes, but determined to ignore any idea of abnormal phenomena. The moment I entered the cemetery, I headed straight for Marion's grave. I felt compelled to check if everything was in its place. When I arrived, I saw someone had left a garland of white flowers arranged in a half-moon shape, forming a sort of path that pointed toward the headstone. There were no footprints in the soil, nothing to show where the person might have walked. Of course, people often leave flowers for loved ones, but his family didn't seem like the type to do something so discreet. And that particular arrangement made me uneasy for reasons I couldn't explain. It looked like some kind of symbol. In the middle of the flowers, I found a piece of embroidered cloth with gold thread, folded into a tiny bundle. I opened it carefully and saw there was a dark powder inside. It didn't smell like anything I recognized. Thinking it might be another offering or ritual item, I placed it in a plastic bag to throw away later. I tried to carry on with my day, but around 11 in the morning when Damien arrived, he noticed the serious look on my face. "You look worn out, Mario. Something wrong?" Damien is younger than I am and usually jokes about everything, but at that moment he seemed genuinely concerned. "I'm not sure if it's wrong, but strange things have been happening at the new grave, the one belonging to Marion." He furrowed his brow as if trying to recall. "That's the older gentleman who was into those unusual prayers, right?" I told Damien what I had seen, the candles relighting themselves, the leaves reappearing on the surface, the unexplained flowers. He didn't laugh or make a joke, which surprised me. He looked at me seriously and simply said, "Some folks said he dealt with things that push the limits. Maybe you shouldn't interfere with the offerings they leave. You know how it is. When we mess with things we don't understand, the consequences can be strange." I admit I felt some relief talking to someone about it, but I also worried that I was feeding superstition. I'd never believed much in manifestations beyond what can be explained. Even so, the coincidences were unsettling. Around 5 in the afternoon, I decided to visit the church near the town square to talk to Father Anselm. He already knew me from other funerals, and when he greeted me, he noticed my anxious state. "What's going on, Mario?" I explained what had been happening, trying not to sound exaggerated. He listened in silence, gaze focused, and in the end said that sometimes when a person is involved with older forms of prayer, they can leave spiritual residues that manifest subtly. He advised me to respect any objects left at the grave and to pray for Marion, asking that he find peace. It sounded a bit vague to me, but I accepted his advice. I returned to the cemetery the next day, determined to leave any offerings where they were. If something new appeared, I wouldn't move it. By around 8 in the morning, as I did my inspection, I noticed that in addition to the white flowers from the day before, someone had positioned 2 more colored candles, the same type I'd seen at the funeral, and a few small ceramic pieces painted with symbols I didn't recognize. I approached them but didn't have the nerve to remove anything. I remembered Damien's words and Father Anselm's advice. I left everything there and carried on with my routine. That night the cemetery was especially quiet. I stayed later than usual because I had to inspect a wall that had started to crack near some of the oldest vaults. As I walked around, I thought I heard footsteps, light, dragging sounds, but they stopped as soon as I paused to listen carefully. I decided to do a full circuit of the aisles. Everything was empty. Perhaps it was just the wind in the branches or a cat wandering around. Even so, the atmosphere felt different, almost as if that corner was cut off from the rest of the world. I didn't see anything concrete and chose not to dwell on my imagination. I locked the cemetery around 9 and went home. In the following days, the offerings continued to appear. Candles, little sculptures, folded papers with phrases I couldn't decipher. None of it truly scared me, but the constant repetition began to bother me. I asked around town if anyone had seen Marion's relatives entering the cemetery late, but nobody had any information. People said his family left right after the funeral, taking everything they had from his house. One afternoon, while I was doing minor paint touch-ups on some graves, I noticed a damp, reddish stain exactly where Marion's coffin lay underground. It looked like the soil was soaked with something more than water. I touched it lightly with my paintbrush, but it didn't have a metallic smell or anything like that, just a bitter odor that reminded me of crushed herbs. I tossed some extra soil over it. Damien, who was nearby, saw the look on my face but didn't say anything right away. It was only at the end of the day that he approached me. "That man left more than memories, huh? This afternoon I found a piece of cloth tied to a tree branch with weird symbols scrawled on it. Do you think people are still doing some kind of ritual or leaving offerings for him?" I by then had no idea what to think. I shook my head. "I don't know what's going on, but maybe we shouldn't interfere. Let's just keep the place tidy where we can and leave the rest alone." He agreed. Still, the thought of nighttime rituals or unauthorized visitors unnerved me. I always thought that if something out of the ordinary occurred, there would be clearer signs, but everything about this was too subtle. One night I decided to hide behind the small tool shed and stay later than usual, thinking that if anyone really was sneaking in after hours, I could catch them and figure out once and for all who it was. I did my normal shift, locked the gate, turned off the lights and made sure I had a gap to watch the main corridor. I waited until about 10 at night. Everything was calm and silent, just the occasional croak of frogs in the distance. When I got tired, I was about to head home when a faint glow caught my eye on the far side of the cemetery near Marion's grave. I stood up carefully and walked behind the mausoleums, stepping lightly to avoid making noise. As I got closer, I realized the glow came from a candle someone had placed inside a glass jar to protect the flame from the wind, yet I saw no one around. I looked everywhere. No shadows, no sign of a person. Just that single candle burning as if it had appeared from nowhere. I blew it out, but as I did, an intense feeling of unease washed over me. The air felt heavy, motionless, though I can't explain why. I left the jar on the ground and decided to deal with it the next day. When I got home, I couldn't stop replaying the image of that candle in the glass. It was just a candle, something completely normal in a cemetery, yet it unnerved me that it showed up without my seeing anyone. By then, I was exhausted from trying to rationalize every incident. I felt a constant weight on my shoulders, as if I were working day and night with no break. I ended up falling asleep with the television on, something I rarely do just to keep myself distracted. The next day I told Damien what had happened. He gave me a look that was part concern, part seriousness, and suggested, "Why don't we talk to Father Anselm again? Maybe he has some other advice." So we went to the church after lunch. Father Anselm welcomed us in a small room next to the sacristy and listened patiently. When we finished, he took a deep breath. Perhaps what's going on isn't really about Marion himself, but what he left behind. Some people follow old traditions, and when they pass, others keep up those customs. It could be a way of upholding a promise, a debt, or something we don't understand. You two should be careful not to stop a process that might be important to them. He suggested we say a prayer at the site, asking that any spirit or energy there find peace. I'm not a particularly religious man, but I was open to anything that might bring us some relief. So at dusk, Damien and I went to Marion's grave. We brought a small container of holy water and prayed. It wasn't an elaborate ritual, just some words of good intention and a sign of respect. We finished and went back to our usual tasks. For a few days it seemed to work. No new candles, no strange offerings, no peculiar smells. That calm, however, was short-lived. About a week later, when we were already feeling relieved, something happened that truly disturbed me. Early one morning, I found the cemetery gate slightly ajar. I was certain I'd locked it the night before. The lock wasn't broken or damaged. I looked around and didn't see anything obviously out of place. But as I approached Marion's grave, I saw the soil seem to have been dug up, as if someone had started excavating. The headstone was still there, but there were marks of a shovel or hoe, maybe 18 inches deep. It looked like someone had tried to unearth the coffin and then stopped. I tried to figure out if it was vandalism or something related to a ritual. The dirt was loose, but you couldn't see into the coffin. I began refilling the hole with my shovel, feeling a strong surge of anxiety. Damien arrived about an hour later, finding me agitated and sweating, trying to put everything back the way it was. He widened his eyes. "Who would do this?" "I don't know, but it's not normal. I'm going to install an extra padlock on the gate, and maybe we should add a latch on the inside too." He agreed. I spent the rest of the day with the sense we were witnessing something serious. That night, I didn't have the courage to stay there alone on watch. I locked up the cemetery and double secured the gate, adding an extra chain, but I went home feeling tormented. Once I was back, I couldn't eat much. The thought that someone had tried to dig up Marion without authorization weighed on me heavily. The next morning, I decided to speak with Father Anselm again and explain the situation. He looked worried and offered to help us contact the local authorities, but we had no solid evidence of a crime, only signs of possible vandalism. Even so, deep down, I suspected this wasn't common vandalism. It felt like it had a purpose, something tied to that strange devotion some people had for Marion. Time passed and the incidents subsided. No one else tried to dig up the grave, but the little offerings kept appearing more discreetly. Sometimes we'd find a vase of rue, other times a clay pot painted with designs that mixed different religious symbols. Eventually, I stopped worrying so much. I focused on keeping the cemetery tidy and told Damien not to throw away any items left at Marion's grave. He complied, somewhat grudgingly, but understood it was better to avoid trouble. Even with this apparent truce, there were still nights when I slept poorly. It felt like part of me was always on alert. I began having confused dreams in which I was walking through the cemetery aisles and encountered an older man in light-colored clothes standing by that grave. He didn't speak. He just lifted his hand toward me. I'd wake with my heart pounding, unable to recall details, but with that gesture clear in my mind. I tried to see it all as stress-induced. Damien, on the other hand, didn't show much concern, but I noticed he avoided doing nighttime rounds. He'd find excuses to leave before sunset. I couldn't blame him, since I also wasn't thrilled to stay there after dark. Still, our routine carried on without major disturbances, until one afternoon a woman appeared at the cemetery looking very distressed. She said she was Marion's daughter and had come from another region seeking something her father had left behind. She spoke to me plainly. My father kept some writings that belonged to our family, prayers and instructions for preparing herbs. I need them. I replied that I hadn't seen anything in his house since I never went inside. But she persisted. He might have been buried with them, or someone might have brought them here during the funeral. If you find anything, please let me know. We walked over to Marion's grave. I explained I couldn't allow the tomb to be opened without legal procedures. She looked frustrated but didn't push further. She just asked me to call her if I discovered any clue about those writings. I asked if she had any idea who could be leaving offerings. She sighed. Probably people my father helped while he was alive, who follow certain traditions. He wasn't just a casual prayer man. Some saw him as a channel for blessings. Maybe they're still trying to maintain spiritual contact with him. When she left, it made more sense to me that the offerings were tokens of respect or payments for promises. If Marion truly performed healings or protection rituals, it's likely many people believed in his power even after his death. Weeks passed, and the cemetery returned to its usual calm, aside from the ongoing appearance of offerings. Since we no longer removed them, they began to accumulate, though they didn't really make a mess. Mostly flowers, candles, and small handcrafted objects of wood or cloth. Nothing disruptive. Damien became more at ease, and so did I, though I still felt uneasy about what happened after dark. Marion's daughter never came back. Life went on. Then, one evening, I had to stay late for a burial scheduled at the last minute. By the time I finished everything, it was past 8. I turned out the lights and was about to lock the gate when I heard a soft murmur, almost like a gentle chant, coming from the back of the cemetery. I called out for Damien, but he had left long before. I thought about pretending I hadn't heard anything, but curiosity got the better of me. I walked down the central corridor toward the source of the sound. When I neared Marion's grave, I saw a figure kneeling, head bowed. It looked like an older person with a black scarf covering their head. I stopped a few yards away, trying to figure out what they were saying. Before I could speak, the person rose calmly. I didn't get a good look at the face because the light was so dim, but I saw they were holding a rosary in one hand and a lit candle in the other. "Excuse me, but the cemetery is closing now." The figure inclined their head slightly as if asking permission and left without a word. I stood there, uncertain. They left the candle on the ground by the grave, still lit. For a moment I wanted to snuff it out, but something stopped me. I returned slowly, thinking about what I had just seen. The person hadn't seemed threatening, but the entire scene felt undeniably strange. The next morning, the candle was exactly where it had been, almost fully spent, yet it left no puddle of wax. It was as if it had barely melted at all. I made my usual rounds without touching it. When I told Father Anselm what happened, he simply remarked, "Sometimes people have their own ways of honoring those who help them. I don't see any harm in letting that candle remain, as long as no one's being hurt." I agreed, though I still had my doubts. I couldn't figure out why Marion kept drawing so many mysterious visitors. But I did realize that not everything requires an explanation. The cemetery remained a place of farewells and memories, some quieter than others. As the months went on, I occasionally heard from visitors who reported odd sights around Marion's grave. Never anything violent, just murmurs, candles, flowers appearing and vanishing. It seemed these admirers or grateful souls carried on their devotion even if they weren't part of an organized group. I understood it wasn't my job to interfere as long as the site stayed respectful. I'm not as skeptical as I once was. I still don't believe in ghosts the way movies portray them, but I've learned there are prayers and ceremonies that can influence people's minds, and maybe, in some way, the environment around them. I don't need scientific proof to sense that certain phenomena go deeper than my own convictions. I keep opening the cemetery every day, cleaning headstones and raking leaves. But whenever I pass by Marion's grave, I keep a bit of distance. It's not out of fear, it's out of respect. His life may have been filled with mysteries, and I'm not here to solve what isn't mine to solve. I still get the occasional visitor asking about something connected to the deceased. Usually the conversations go nowhere because I have little to offer. I just advise them to be respectful of the space and, if they want to leave objects, to do so without damaging anything. Since it causes no real harm, I see no reason to forbid it. Damien has also adapted. He's grown used to seeing small candles flickering on moonless nights, and sometimes he just tells me it's another ordinary evening, right? I agree, because now I realize a cemetery is like a cauldron of memories, and some people need to keep the flame alive for those who've gone. Whether it's superstition, devotion, or simply remembrance, it's part of being human. I no longer mind staying there after dark, though I avoid lingering too late. If there really are different presences roaming that patch of ground, they seem tied to an act of faith or gratitude, not violence. Marion's headstone still receives white flowers almost every week, and occasionally a colored candle is found burning with no one taking credit for it. It appears he remains cherished by those who knew him or benefited from his prayers. I know this account may sound strange, but it's what I experienced. There were no loud noises or scenes worthy of a horror film, just small signs that the departed can continue to be influential in the lives of those they leave behind, especially when their stories don't end with their last breath. If someone asks me whether I believe in hauntings, I'd say I'm not sure, but I respect what I can't understand. And if someday you visit a cemetery and see a candle burning in an unusual spot, don't be alarmed. Maybe it's just a reminder that some farewells keep unfolding, even when we're not looking. Hey everyone, thanks for listening. Click the notification bell to stay updated on all future narrations. I post new videos here every day. I hope to see you in the next one. On the screen now, I'm leaving 2 other great videos I know you'll enjoy. See you there.